What's that? We're live? Good evening, everyone, even though it's clearly afternoon. And welcome to Real News Media Broadcasting, The Real News, or RNN, BRN for short. Today we are interviewing a full-time author and YouTuber, Bethany Atazadeh? Atazadeh. Think of it like all ah sounds. Atazadeh. We are so glad to have you here on our show to discuss the raw and real life of a full-time author and YouTuber. Thank you for being here today. Sure. We have polled our viewers and asked them to send us very personal and intrusive questions so that we can really get the dirt on what it's like to be a full-time author. Our first question from viewers is, what is it like to be less important and less qualified than traditionally published authors? Well, no book is perfect, but I do have a few hundred positive reviews. Oh, well, we assume that since there are occasional quality issues within the self-publishing industry as a whole, since there are no gatekeepers, that this must apply to all self-published books. I mean, I won an award for Best Indie Author in Minnesota. That's very reflective. Are you sure that's not a mere kidding? Anyway, let's talk about something more important than the quality of the book or the lack thereof. Let's talk about the money. Can publishing a book make you rich and famous? If you're talking about like J.K. Rowling or Stephen King level, I do think that's the exception to the rule, but that's not to say that you can't make amazing money doing self-publishing and that you can't have an amazing group of devoted readers, because you absolutely can. I think it's completely possible to do really well financially and succeed. It's just that it takes a long time to build up to that point, and not everybody's willing to stick it out. I see. Our viewers have just a few more questions about the finances side. They want to know, how do you make it a viable living? And are you able to support yourself or at least supplement your bills? I am. Interesting. When would you say that you started earning enough to cover your basic expenses? It took a couple years to get off the ground. Honestly, I think I heard this statistic once that the average business, and this is basically a business, takes roughly 2 years to gain momentum and start to make more money than it's spending. And obviously everybody's journey is totally different, so it's not like that's an exact mile marker by any means, but I did find that I was roughly around the 2-year mark when I started to see a drastic improvement as well. It can take years of hard work and not everyone's willing to stick it out, so I definitely think it should be something you do for the passion of it and not just for the money. Wonderful. Our next question is, as an indie author, what would you say your typical ROI, or return on investment, time frame is for when you can make your money back after a book release? That's such a good question. I know with my debut that I made my money back before I ever published, because I was doing something called a Kickstarter, and it was my way of making sure that this was exactly what I should be doing and that I could sell enough before publishing. Otherwise, that Kickstarter platform had the option to give everyone their money back if I couldn't make a certain goal financially. And so that was my way of tracking if I was on the right path. But then with the Stolen Kingdom series, I had to look back at my records because I didn't honestly know off the top of my head. But so far, with the first 3 books, I have made my money back either before the release or during the week of the release, and we will see what happens with the Enchanted Crown. I have a video coming out on that very soon. We'll make sure to tell viewers to subscribe to see that video. Okay, let's be real. Even though this question was cut off, I think we can all read between the lines here. We really want to know, how much money do you make? That's a very personal question. So sorry, yes, absolutely. No, but you know, if you were to give, you know, a ballpark figure. Well, I actually did share how much I made last year in 2020. If you're interested, I did a video on my 2021 goals, and I might have slipped in the amount I made last year into that video. If you're curious, you'll have to go watch it. Yes, absolutely, of course. But if you were to share, what would that look like? I suppose we have other questions to cover besides money. Let's see here. 1 second. Okay. Oh, here we go. Okay. I see there are quite a few questions about your career as well. One viewer asks, is it everything that you hoped it would be as a career? And at what point did you feel comfortable with writing being your career? And finally, is being an author as amazing as you thought it would be? I think I expected writing to be a lot easier and publishing to be a lot faster, honestly. But other than that, I didn't really know what to expect because all I could really have to go on was other authors' highlight reels, you know what I mean? Some ways that it surprised me was that it took a lot longer to get off the ground than I expected, like we kind of talked about, but it was also 1,000 times more rewarding as well. I posted recently on Instagram this comparison of how it's kind of like building a house. Like you wouldn't put, one piece of wood on the ground and be like, it's done, because it takes so much more than that to build a house. It's like a brick by brick by brick process. And it's the same thing with a writing career or writing a book in general or other creative endeavors or business pursuits. It's a brick by brick by brick. You keep putting in the time hour by hour, day by day. It's not an overnight thing the way that some people think it is. Nothing is really an overnight success, honestly. So yeah, it was definitely a lot more difficult than I expected for sure, but it was also just every mile marker was a million times more rewarding and more exciting because you knew everything you put into it to get to that place. I guess I would say it's not what I expected, it's even better. Thank you for sharing. Let's talk about your debut for a moment. Our first viewer's question is, when did you start writing and when did you start writing seriously with the aim of publishing? I started my first novel in college, actually. I was writing it for, I think, a senior project because I had a creative writing degree, but I had this professor who wrote just totally different genres. She was all about poetry and autobiography, and everything I wrote was just not even close to good enough for her. I felt criticized at every turn. I honestly felt like the subtext with everything she said was, you should not be doing this. This is not for you. It was so discouraging. Some personalities might do well with criticism versus encouragement, but I'm the type of person who needs to be told what I'm doing well, not just what I'm sucking at, you know what I mean? So I feel like I was so incredibly discouraged by the point that I graduated that I didn't write at all after that, and I didn't even read anymore for a long time. I stopped reading altogether. That experience is one of the reasons that it's so important to me to be encouraging to other writers as well, because I never want to do to someone else what that professor did to me. It was so sad. But then about almost 10 years later, I was working in healthcare and I had climbed my way up the ladder. I had this really awesome job that I finally liked in administration in the corporate offices. And then our department got laid off, like 60 plus people. And that was quite a shock, but honestly, it ended up being amazing because I had, I think it was a little over 3 months of severance pay. I had been in the hospital system so long that I was able to continue getting paid for 3 more months. And my hubby and I talked and I was like, I think I want to give this a shot. This seems like a really good time to attempt to work for myself, because he worked for himself and he did amazing at it. And I definitely didn't want to go back to work somewhere else and start all over again at the bottom if I could figure out how to work for myself. I took that really unique window of time and I came back to Evelyn's Number and I started writing the story again. I basically started from scratch. I threw out everything that I had done for that professor and that grade, and I just wrote for myself and I wrote what I wanted the story to be. And was the first book that you published the first book you ever wrote? Technically, as a kid, I wrote a dog training manual, but I basically plagiarized that whole thing from other dog training books at the library. So yes, technically Evelyn's Number is the first novel that I ever wrote. And what is it like looking back to when you were on your first novel? I was such a newbie. Oh my gosh, looking back, I had no idea what I was doing. That book just represents this huge change in my life, just a 180-degree turn, figuring out how to start a business, set up an LLC, you know, I started my YouTube channel right like a month before I published my first book, and figuring out how to work with beta readers for the first time and how to hire an editor And what else? It honestly, it represents my growth so much as a writer. Like, I've grown so much since then as well, but that was definitely a turning point. And looking back, I see that. I honestly might be a little bit scared to go back and read that first book, but it's so much more than just that one story in my first book to me, you know what I mean? It represents that huge change and that turning point in my life. So interesting. And that leads perfectly to our next question about your debut, which is, would you change your first book, and do you regret things in it? And another viewer wondered a very similar thing, which was, are you ever embarrassed or ashamed of the things you did in your debut novel? This is such a good question. Honestly, I am both super proud and embarrassed at the same time, because I think I've said this before, but with each book that you write, you become a better writer. And so that naturally means that all the books that came before are not as good. They can still be good, but they're no longer your best, because each new book that you put out becomes your new best. And so Evelyn's Number is 5 books ago now, I think. And so I have grown so much. I know that there are certain things that if I look back, I know what my weaknesses were. They are still my weaknesses now, but I have grown so much. And so I know that if I look back, I will probably see a lot of telling, because I was still learning so much about that. And I will probably see overwriting, where you tell more of the story than the reader really needs to know. What else? Oh, I had an editor teach me later on with The Stolen Kingdom about something called RUE, which is resist the urge to explain. And that's just a habit that I had as well, where I would show something and then tell the reader as if they couldn't see it happen. Like the character crosses his arms, and then I would add in anger, that kind of stuff, where I know I would look back and I would see things that would bother me. Because I have grown so much, I've become more aware. I'm still growing, so I think that'll always be the case when I look back on anything. But at the same time, the story itself is still so good, and I'm still so proud of it. And like I said, it's not just the story that I'm proud of, I'm also proud of the journey that it represents and the new beginning that it represents. So ultimately, no, while I might be embarrassed of a certain little things within the writing itself that I'm like, ooh, I know how to write that better now. Ultimately, no, I'm not embarrassed of it, because it shows how far I've come. Speaking of how far you've come, let's talk about how far your stories come from the first draft to the final draft. Our next question from our viewers is, how much does your story evolve from the original idea as you write and edit? I've never paid attention to what stays so much as to what gets deleted, but I can say for sure that almost always my ending changes either like 80% or 100%. There have been a couple instances where I actually threw out my whole ending altogether and just wrote a new one. I heard once that supposedly your first idea that you get is usually the most cliche, and so is like the second and the third, and it isn't until you get to your fourth and fifth brainstorming idea and so on that you start to get into more unique things that might be more exciting and interesting to a reader. And so I feel like when it comes to my endings, I usually write my first idea, and then when I go into edits, that's when I start tweaking it and getting to the second, third, fourth, and fifth idea and start figuring out something more interesting. But honestly, I have to write that first draft before I can figure out how I want to change it. I have to write the cliche before I figure out how to make it more interesting. It's almost like steps on a staircase where you have to write this one to get to this one to get to this one, and it's just part of the process. I've accepted it now.
That's so interesting. And how many hours would you say you write in a day?
I've talked about this before, but I actually don't write every day, and sometimes not even every month. Like this month, I am releasing a book, so I actually haven't written at all. And last month, I only wrote a little bit, like maybe a few days out of the entire month. But then other months, when I set a deadline for myself, I like to use NaNoWriMo as my kind of inspiration for how I approach deadlines. So I'll usually pick like a month, and I'll dedicate that month to writing a certain project. And then just like in NaNoWriMo, I'll have an overall word count goal, but then I'll also break it down into daily goals, and that way I can kind of track every day if I'm on target. But even then, I don't write every day, and when I do write, it's usually no more than 2 or 3 hours, because honestly, there's a limit to how creative you can be in a day. And I feel like if I tried to write more than that, I would write almost the same amount as if I just did 2 or 3 hours, because again, you run out of creative juices at a certain point. Editing, I could probably go a little longer, but you definitely get burnt out doing that as well. So I feel like just a few hours a day max. I definitely cannot write 8 hours a day for sure. Those deadlines sound exhausting. Let's talk more about that. What do you do when you start to feel burnt out? This is tough because I definitely don't feel like I handle burnout that well. I'm still learning. Sometimes I push through, but I honestly think that's a mistake. And so what I've been learning and sort of been getting better at, I'm still working on it, is to catch that burnout, be more self-aware first of all, and then take a look at everything that's on your plate, or the way I described it recently, and I was blogging behind the scenes of my book release, and I described it as like you're juggling a lot of balls and you know that you're about to drop one or more than one. So instead of just seeing which one drops, which it could be a really important one, you instead look at everything you've got going on and figure out which one of the balls you want to drop and toss it before it gets too crazy. So it's definitely about being more self-aware, I think. Thank you so much for sharing and being here today. Thank you for having me. Those were great questions. Thank you for joining us on Real News Media Broadcasting Real News, or RNMBRN for short. So glad we had a chance to talk. Hopefully other writers out there watching this interview will give it a thumbs up, and who knows, maybe even possibly buy your book. There's a small chance. For now, back to our regularly scheduled programming of corgis playing with a laser.
Government officials insist that this
I was knocked down, heard the countdown through the haze, in the face of defeat, yeah. I was ruled out with no bailout, on my own, all alone, left to bleed out. But I rose up from the ground, just like I was spellbound. All the odds were against
For RNMBRN for short. Yeah, you know what? It's close enough. We're gonna try to put your booty in this bag, like the cool people. All the cool dogs do it. Trust me. Change scene. I don't know if this is gonna work. Does this look like an interviewer outfit? Your booty is a lot bigger than it used to be. Do you trust your mama? Do you trust me? Good girl. Oh yeah, we're just gonna tuck you into it. Don't worry, I know you don't really fit. What does? Oh, right, we're recording. Okay. Yeah, this isn't going that well, is it? I'm gonna give you such a nice phone after this. Side note, totally fine with these questions. I actually asked everybody to send in questions that would be like whatever they'd want most to ask an author, not me personally, but I'm using them for me personally. Good girl. Now sit in the bag. Is it stressful? I'm so sorry. You look very cute though. We're so glad to have you here and do this. Okay, what was I saying? Oh my gosh. You're falling over. I feel so weird not looking at you guys. It's so weird. Anyway, okay, Mama's gonna let you out. I feel guilty. Ready? That was fun. Line. There's such a glare going on. I don't know if this is gonna work. Let's just turn it off. I can't do this. All right, I think that's a wrap. Ah! See how it went.